Coming up on tonight's episode of Faith versus Culture, to Santa or not to Santa? That's the question. We're going to try to answer it coming up next.
To have sex before you marry is a bad idea.
Don't tell me there's no such thing as gun violence.
That just depends on your definition of when life begins.
There are problems of sin and habit that cannot be solved outside the person of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, hello and welcome to this episode of Faith versus Culture right here on the CBN News Channel. My name is Dan Andros. I'm managing editor of CBN's Faithwire.com, joined by Tré Goins-Phillips and Billy Hallowell. Fellas, what's going on?
Living the dream. Excited to be here.
Right? Yeah, it's Christmas. Like literally, it's Christmas now.
It is.
I know. Well, and we are, of course, diving into a Christmas topic, one that I don't even know if it's like that controversial these days. I know it's something that some Christians deal with, but I feel like it's such a popular thing that people go down the Santa route that most people just do the Santa thing. I don't know how, we're going to discuss it today, pros and cons here, but do you guys think this is like a really fringe issue that some people are concerned with Santa Claus, or from the Christian perspective, or is it more common than I think?
Oh, no, I think it's more common than you think. I think that my view is that the three biggest arguments in Christianity when it comes to culture are Halloween, Christmas, and the rapture. I mean, those are the three things that get people the most worked up. And I think Santa, in my family, Santa is a major point of contention. And I know for a lot of other people in Christian families, he is as well.
Yeah. I think that the Santa debate is an interesting one because it's one of the ones that I think people get really angry about. But I don't think, and I know this will probably frustrate some people, I don't think it's that huge of a deal, but it's something that we have an outsized reaction to a lot of times. But it's still, I think, good to have the conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, people on the other side of this issue are probably going to think, well, no, it is a big deal, and that's why we need to talk about it. But I agree with you, probably coming from a different perspective that you have on it, Tré or Billy. I think I also don't think it's an issue of salvation or, having to question that or anything, but I would put it more in that category of just discernment and wisdom. And so hopefully at the very least, like we get you, if you haven't thought about it before, because I know that's been my story. Like I hadn't thought about it. I just, that's what I grew up with. So I just did it. And so, I've kind of changed my tune over the years that I've had kids and stuff. So that's just where I'm at on this. I'm not saying that you have to do one or the other. So I just want to get that out of the way first. But I do think it's a discussion worth having. Just so at least parents and Christians can kind of get used to being in that mode of, coming up with good rationale for things and using discernment and thinking things through.
Yeah, and I actually think there are two key areas, and maybe you guys will think there are other areas to look at, but to me, the first area when you have this conversation, and I'm actually probably somewhere between the two of you on this, which is why this is kind of an interesting conversation for us to be having. But the first area is, Christmas and the true meaning of Christmas and whether or not Santa takes away from that or doesn't. And I think for me, the second area that I look at is truth-telling and children and what happens if and when they find out the truth about Santa, which I know that might make some people laugh or other people say, no, that's a legitimate concern. But I do think to me, those are the two areas we kind of have to look at here. I don't know. What do you guys think?
No, I agree with you. The truth thing is kind of one that like stuck with me in particular, because one of the ways I look at it, and the average age of people, I looked up a survey, the average age that kids stop believing in Santa is like just under 10. The older end of the spectrum is around 10, like you're 8, 9, 10, somewhere in there is kind of when they just stop. And so the issue I have is that, because I know one of the arguments is, you should be able to play with the imaginations and let the imaginations run. My problem with that line of thinking is that you're not presenting it as just imagination. You're presenting it as truth. At some point, they just sort of stop believing in it. There's not like an age where parents are like, you know what, we should tell them now. It's just wait until they find out, until they just figure it out. And you look at some of the parallels with Santa being omniscient, having a lot of God-like qualities that are conjured up here. to describe him, and then they just suddenly unbelieve in Santa. What it's very similar to like God. Why would they then suddenly detach God from that? I mean, to me, it seems like they're very close in nature. And so I feel like, why would you pour into that story if it's just going to fall away, and then would maybe potentially contribute to thoughts on God that they might have?
Well, I mean, here I was as an 18-year-old still believing in Santa Claus, and then all my dreams were. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't believe in Santa Claus at 18 years old. That's not true.
Yeah.
But the reality is, I think y'all are both right. I think the argument does come to truth, and then is it distracting from the true meaning of Christmas, which is, of course, the coming of our Savior. Like, I think for my family, the way that we did it growing up was actually kind of a blend between maybe truth and imagination. When we were really young, of course, it's kind of hard as a little kid to really grasp what's imagination. But as we got older, a little bit older, like 4, 5, 6, in that age range, my parents started having the conversation about this kind of being a mystical figure. This is an imaginary figure. Santa Claus, he was a real person. Saint Nicholas was a real person who did great things as a religious leader of his day. So I think reflecting on those things and seeing kind of the modern day commercialized fun Santa Claus that we see, like Tim Allen in the Santa Claus movies, that character is really just echoes of those great qualities that the original St. Nicholas had. And that's kind of how I grew up seeing it, as this is a representation, right, of these qualities that are fantastic. And where did the qualities come from? The qualities are an outpouring of Jesus. So I think really one way that Christians, I think, can use Santa, regardless of where we fall on the issue with our own families, is we can use it as a bridge, right? We can use it as a way to have conversations with unbelievers and say, the reason that Santa Claus has all of these great qualities and the reason that we like all of these qualities is because they are a product of his faith and allegiance to Christ. So I think there's a way of marrying the two concepts.
Well, Trey, you can't spell Santa without Satan. Just, no, I'm kidding. Well, I'm not, but no, it's, I think it's very complicated when you look at it, because I think about myself when I found out about Santa, because I grew up in a family where it wasn't quite like yours necessarily, Trey, where there was a distinction. It was just like most parents do. Here's Santa, he sees you when you're sleeping, he knows when you're awake, which is super creepy. But when you're a kid, you're all excited for it, right? But when I found out about it, it actually really upset me. Like, I can remember, and I know this might sound silly, but I was a kid. Like, I remember exactly where I was sitting, what I was doing, where I was when I found out about it. I still remember it. I don't remember half of the things that went on at that time. So it clearly was a big event, for me as a kid. Did it ruin my life? No, I moved on. Who cares, right? You grow up. But I do think there's an element there. We do Santa with my kids now, right? So I'm kind of talking out of both ends of my mouth here, but I do have those kinds of concerns because my older kid didn't really ever believe. Like, she pretended to, kind of. She always, when she was 5 years old, was like, that Santa looks like, grandpa, right? Like, she knew that it was him dressing up. She could tell. So I don't know. I do think it is, to your point, Dan, if you are telling kids this big thing and centering everything around it, and then you tell them, oh, it's not true, we've been lying to you for 9 years, right? I can understand why, and I know people will scoff at this, why some might say, well, what is your kid going to say about God? What is your kid going to say about other things you're telling them? So I think that's a legitimate argument.
Yeah. No, and that's just one of the areas that kind of convicted me and made me think about it. Another one is just some of the themes that are common. Like, Trey, it sounds like your house had more of a balanced approach to it that, that kind of connected faith with that. But I think with culture today, I think your home, if I had to guess, would be more of the exception than the rule. But I want to go over a couple of those cultural narratives that pop in here with Santa and see how they line up with biblical narratives. So we'll do that on the other side of the break. This is Faith versus Culture. Back in a sec. All right, we are back here on Faith versus Culture. Dan Andros here, Billy Hallowell, Tré Goins-Phillips there. We are talking about Santa. Should you do it or should you not as a Christian? And, we've got a wide range of views just amongst the three of us. But I want to pick it up where we left off there and talking about, Billy, you had mentioned last break that song, he knows if you're sleeping, he knows if you're awake, so he knows if you've been bad or good, so be good for goodness sake. You better watch, and then this, you better watch out, you better not cry, you better not pout. I'm telling you why Santa Claus is coming to town. Now, I always viewed this as a very, sort of manipulative kind of way that you just be good. You got creepy, like you said, Billy, creepy guy looking through the window watching you. And if you're naughty, you're not going to get presents. If you're good, you're going to get presents. It's, a very works-based me, I got to get stuff. Like you're feeding that, like, I see human nature. I don't need to spend more effort into making me or my kids more greedy or more selfish about the stuff we want. And so, and I know that's a secular song, but like those are the sorts of songs, if you just have a regular Christmas channel on or something like that, that's what we sing. And that's what we pour into our kids. And I think it's hard enough to put this stuff into our kids with all the distractions in the world, that when we go down those sorts of narratives, like we're just teaching them things that are anti-biblical.
Yeah. I'm pondering this and thinking, for me, because I'm so torn, right? I'm torn on this because there is that element of fun. But I think when you do elevate those godlike fixtures and features, it becomes a little more, problematic. It's hard for me because I grew up with it and I do it with my own kids, but I recognize if you were to both lay out your arguments to me, I would actually resonate with all of them, both of you. And I think a lot of Christians are in that position. I do think, Dan, when you said in the beginning, this is something that you shouldn't just put the screensaver on, I think we should be praying about it. I think we need to be going to God, like, God, where do you want me on this? That should be our first step. And I would imagine 90% of Christians probably, and I shouldn't assume that, but I think it's probably true, haven't done that on this issue.
Yeah, well, I think it's easy whenever you have any sort of cultural trend. It's easy to kind of latch onto that because that's what everybody's doing. Your kids are going to come home and they're going to ask you about it. So it's difficult, I think, to take a position that's contrary to something that's such a larger than life tradition in American culture and Western culture generally. So I do think that there probably is a knee-jerk reaction to just go along with the flow of culture and to not really engage this in any sort of real way. But I think as Christians, it's critical that we engage it. And then I think, like I was saying in the previous segment, whatever the tradition is, I think we need to make a decision. Is this one that's even worth keeping? Does it have any redeemable qualities, or is it something that we should throw out altogether? Halloween is one that a lot of Christians decide we're going to throw this out altogether because I don't really see any redeeming qualities in it at all. Whereas I think Santa Claus, you can make the argument both ways. Like that's one that I think is a little bit grayer because he was originally, though, again, we've gotten so far away from the original character of St. Nicholas, he was a Christian character. So I think there are opportunities to have those conversations with your children about, like you said, Dan, I think there is the tendency to kind of use it as blackmail. Like, well, if you're a bad kid, if you don't behave well, then you can pass the duty of disciplining off to some mystical figure, Santa Claus. So I think that's a bad way of looking at it. But if you look at the other things about him, the good qualities, I think he really is a personification, of course imperfect, but he's a good analogy, I think, of how a Christian should react to the coming of Christ and to the work of Christ in redeeming us and transforming us and sanctifying us. So I think there are redeemable qualities there, whereas with other holidays or other secular traditions, it's harder to make the argument that there's anything redeemable there.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think what you said to me is where I probably struggle the most with it, is that culture, like the original character, Saint Nick, like if that was leading to a holiday here at Christmas time where everyone was being like Saint Nick and getting together a bunch of presents and going and helping the poor and helping those in need, I'd be all for celebrating Saint Nick because it would be producing some fruit that was very Christ-like. I feel like what you said is true. Like the caricature of Santa has gone so far as just a toy dispenser from the sky. Like we've gone that direction. And so now most kids just are ready to just serve themselves on Christmas. They can't wait to just get a bunch of stuff. And who doesn't love getting a bunch of stuff, right? I mean, we're sinful in nature. We're greedy in nature. We are selfish in nature. So that feeds right into all of that. And so that is probably where I struggle, is with that the trend of where culture is going with it. The theme I mentioned, like in that song, those sorts of things just seem to perpetuate things that I'm trying to not teach my kid. And to me, it just, at least in our house, it just makes it harder for me to untangle all those things. So, and again, like that's why, because you said, Tré, like there's those redeemable qualities under there. And if you can do an adequate job of tying all those things together and making the holiday about that, then you could probably pull it off. I just know I can't that well. I can barely, put matching socks on every day with everything that's going on. So that's kind of just where we've landed with it.
Yeah, I think, we spend way more time talking about Jesus and celebrating Jesus every day. And a lot of our tradition is we read verses every day. We go through a devotional. I would say it's 5-1 when it comes to Santa. And I know there are people who will say, but you can do both. You can just downplay it, and you can explain to your kids that obviously God is real and that this is something that children do. And I get that argument. I know pastors who actually have no problem with Santa. And I know people who think those pastors are terrible pastors because of that. So it's interesting, sitting in on these debates and these discussions. I do think you have to go with where your legitimate conviction is on this. And there are going to be people who say, but you should be convicted. You should. And some people are going to say, look, I've prayed about it. I'm not convicted. I feel like my kids can handle it. And I think I'm striking the right balance on it. Even saying that, people will be annoyed probably. But I do think that is really the starting point.
Well, and let me just, I want to add too that I think when we have these conversations, and I could make this point about any number of issues, so I don't want to single out just the Santa debate, that there are a lot of issues, and you said this at the beginning of our conversation, Dan, that are salvific in nature, right? There are issues that are foundational and they matter to our faith. Or I shouldn't say matter, this of course matters, but there are ones that are more foundational and critical to what we believe about Jesus. And then there are issues that are kind of secondary. I think this falls into the secondary category. It can be great to not celebrate it. It can also be good to acknowledge Santa if you can find the right balance and strike that based on, as you were saying, Billy, your conviction. So I think a lot of times something that can be off-putting to me, or can be off-putting, I think, to a lot of people, is the anger that we have when we have this conversation on both sides, whether you're somebody who's pro-Santa or somebody who's against celebrating Santa Claus during the Christmas season with your kids. I think we need to all check our hearts and say, look, is this really something that I should get really angry about? Or is this something that I should be reflective and follow my own conviction and certainly share my beliefs with other people, but realize that at the end of the day, people are going to fall in different categories on the issue. And there's not necessarily a sin there, regardless of where you end up going.
Yeah. Can I add one more thing in here, Dan?
Yeah, go for it.
You look at some of the data on this, and there have been some interesting surveys. In 2018, Lifeway asked Americans about their perspective on Christmas, and 65% of them said they wish the holiday was more about Jesus, that it should be more about Jesus. 2 in 3 said that they wanted more Christ in Christmas. And I found that interesting because the majority couldn't give details about Jesus's birth story. So they wanted more Christ in Jesus. They wanted to see more of that, but they admitted we can't tell the story. But I bet you they could tell the story of Santa and the reindeer. I bet you they could tell. Yeah. And I do think that is a major problem. A couple of other stats: 53% of Americans said they could retell the biblical story from memory, but only 22% said they could do it accurately. Those are problematic statistics.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I mean, and you think about it too. I mean, just like think about your family devotionals. Like I'm trying very hard to make like family devotional time fun because, getting 4 kids to come around the table and stay there for 15, 20 minutes, challenge sometimes. But if you were there dishing out presents and doing all the Santa stuff, like it's just easier, right? Like, so, that's probably a failure on our part as Christians that we haven't, made things natural and easier to do when you're trying to, emulate. And of course, I didn't really have that emulated for me, in my younger years. So I'm kind of, flubbing my way through it. But we got a break though. So let's take a quick break. We have time for one more segment. We'll do that on the other side. This is Faith versus Culture. All right, we've been talking about Santa from a Christian perspective here on the program today, and we've got time for just some final thoughts on it.
Yeah, look, we weren't called to ask Santa into our hearts. We asked Jesus into our hearts. So but in seriousness, we should be focused on the true meaning of this season, regardless of where you stand on this, making sure that we've got Christ at the center and that we're not getting so distracted with other things that we've missed that.
Yeah, I grew up obviously in a household that celebrated Santa. I'm a fan of including Santa Claus here, but I also think that at Christmas time there's this temptation to worship the shadows, right? The shadows of Christ instead of worshiping Christ himself. So if that's not your focal point, if Christ isn't your focal point, then all the other stuff really doesn't matter because you're getting all of it wrong. And I know that sounds kind of blunt, but that's the reality of what
That's
Christmas
true.
should be.
Yeah, you're 100% true. And of course, people talk about the reason for the season. And Billy, you said people oftentimes, don't get it. But, I'll just throw in there and you guys can add to it if you want. But the reason for the season is that Jesus Christ, came down from on high, being seated at the right hand of the Father, and humbled himself in the form of a baby and lived fully man, fully God, to grow up, to live a perfect life, to sacrifice himself, die on the cross for our sins, rise again, so that we could, by believing in him, have everlasting life. And so that's the reason for this season, and I hope people can focus on that. Well, that's all the time we have for this episode. We'll be back to just close it out in just a sec. All right, that's all the time we have for this episode of Faith versus Culture right here on the CBN News Channel. As always, we're so thankful that you've decided to spend a few minutes here with us. And don't forget, you can catch the three of us every weekday morning on the Quick Start podcast, every weekday morning, 7 a.m., where we go through the news of the day from a Christian perspective. And we just want to provide an outlet for you to be able to go through the news and share it with someone who shares your values. So God bless you. I hope you've had a fantastic holiday and have a fantastic holiday. And we will see you on the other side. God bless.